Hello and welcome to today's Global Fleet Champions Spotlight session. Global Fleet Champions Spotlights are short, focused webinars to help anyone who employs people who drive for work to manage road risk within their organisation. Each spotlight provides in-depth insight into a particular topic relevant to your fleet safety programme. For more information, please visit globalfleetchampions.org. Today's Spotlight session is focused on driver fatigue. Driver fatigue is one of the most common causes of road crashes. Tired drivers are less likely to spot hazards and less able to react in time to avoid a collision. At today's session, you will learn how driving while tired increases road risk and about effective policies and procedures to reduce the dangers of fatigue. I'm delighted to welcome Paul Jackson from Fresh Air Training, who will be delivering today's Spotlight presentation. In a moment, a multiple choice question poll will appear on your screen so we can find out your views on this topic. It is anonymous. Simply select one answer and press submit, and we will discuss the results at the beginning of the Q&A session, which will take place at the end of today's presentation. You can put forward your questions at any time during the webinar by using the chat box on the webinar panel. The poll question will appear on your screen shortly, and the Spotlight session will then begin. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Paul Jackson. I'm a psychologist working for Fresh Air Training Limited, and I'm here today to talk to you about the issue of driver fatigue. The role of fatigue in workplace incidents has been recognised for many years, and during the last part of the last century, industrial disasters such as Chernobyl, Exxon Valdez, the 3 Mile Island disaster, Bhopal, the Herald of Free Enterprise, and the Challenger space shuttle all focused the attention of safety specialists on this most insidious of human impairments. But whilst incidents such as these are thankfully very rare, employees around the world are still at risk from fatigue. And those involved in transportation operations, particularly aviation, rail, and road transport, are especially vulnerable to its effects. The current global pandemic has further exacerbated the situation. As well as the devastating impact that COVID-19 has had on the lives of those affected by the virus, it has wrought a terrible impact on the global economy, resulting in increased stress and strains on individual health and well-being. And for those involved in road transport operations, this has led to additional demands being placed on professional drivers. My background is in cognitive psychology. I'm a chartered psychologist specializing in human performance and the impairment that results from drugs, alcohol, stress, and fatigue. And for the past 25 years, I've worked with clients, helping them to introduce fatigue risk management systems. And my clients tend to be in safety critical industries, aviation, road transport, mining, oil and gas, and in the emergency services. Sadly, over the years, I've also been involved in a number of cases where a driver involved in a road traffic collision is suspected of having been impaired due to fatigue, often with devastating consequences. And most recently, I was involved in the case against Renown Consultants, a UK-based welding firm providing services to the rail industry, in which 2 of that company's employees tragically died in a road collision when driving home after working a night shift. And this tragic case has brought into sharp focus the importance of companies not just having in place effective fatigue policies and procedures, but also of ensuring that they adhere to those policies in their day-to-day operational practices. My presentation today will focus on the following topics. First, I'm going to look at how fatigue impacts on the brain. As a cognitive psychologist, I'm particularly interested in the changes that occur in the brain when we're suffering from fatigue, particularly the fatigue resulting from sleep loss. Then I'm going to look at how fatigue impacts on our driving performance. I'll then turn to some of the contributors to fatigue. I'll look at work-related contributors, features of a roster that can increase fatigue, and then some of the many lifestyle contributors. Now, obviously, the main costs of fatigue are to the individual, human costs, the tragic loss of life that could result when an individual is suffering from fatigue. But in addition, there are a wide range of other costs that can impact on organizations. And finally, I'll look at some of the steps that organizations can take to more effectively manage and mitigate the risks associated with fatigue. So to begin, let me set out what I mean by fatigue. This is a definition from the International Civil Aviation Organization, and I find it particularly useful because it focuses on three specific aspects of the problem. First of all, it describes fatigue as a physiological state. That means it's not a state of mind, not something that you can overcome with willpower, determination, or training or experience. In fact, it's a physiological need state. So just as when you're hungry, you need food, and when you're thirsty, you need water, when you're fatigued, ultimately, you need sleep. And this state has an impact both on our mental and physical performance capabilities. The definition then goes on to describe some of the causes. And those causes are things like sleep loss, not getting enough sleep, extended wakefulness, being awake for long periods of time of day or circadian phase, and finally workload. The definition then goes on to describe some of the consequences, the fact that fatigue can impair our alertness and our ability to safely operate. Now, the reason that fatigue has all of these impacts is because of changes to our brains that occur when we're suffering from fatigue, and particularly the fatigue resulting from sleep loss. Under normal circumstances, our brains are powered by blood glucose. Blood glucose provides the energy that enables our brains to carry out its various functions. But when we've had insufficient sleep, there is a global reduction in the amount of blood glucose available to our brains. But some areas are more affected than others. For example, a region at the back and at the top of the brain, the parietal lobe, is responsible for integrating all sorts of sensory data. It enables us to perform calculations. And again, this is one of those areas which is most significantly impacted by sleep loss and by fatigue. In the middle of the brain, we have a region called the thalamus, which controls many functions, but in particular, it controls our ability to maintain alertness and vigilance. Again, this area receives less blood glucose when we're suffering from fatigue. At the back and at the bottom, we have the occipital lobe, responsible for processing what we see. And then at the front, we have two big lobes, the prefrontal cortices, which are responsible for what we call higher order processes. Things like problem solving, our ability to control our mood, our reasoning capabilities, our ability to control our emotions, and our ability to communicate. All of these skills are controlled by this region of the brain, and more than any other region of the brain, this is significantly impacted by sleep loss and fatigue. Now, these changes in brain chemistry result in a whole range of impacts, but fundamentally, fatigue can be considered to affect our ability to focus our attention. We're much more easily distracted by irrelevant or unimportant information. And this leads to a whole range of consequences in terms of our cognitive performance. We well know that our alertness is one of the first things to be affected when we're suffering from fatigue. And as a consequence, we make more vigilance and concentration errors. But in addition, when we're fatigued, we find it difficult, more difficult, to follow the rules. So the organization may have procedures in place, or there may be rules of the road, for example, but we're much less likely to comply with those rules when we're suffering from fatigue, and that results in what are called violations or intentional non-compliance errors. Ultimately, this happens because our brains are trying to reduce effort and workload. It's as if our brains are saying, I can't do everything. So do we really need to go through all of those steps, or can we take a few shortcuts? But even when we're trying to do the right thing, when we're fatigued, our ability to follow procedures correctly is affected. So we make more slips and lapses, either by making mistakes in the order in which we do things, or simply by forgetting the steps in a sequence of tasks. And finally, fatigue results in more decision errors. When we're fatigued, we accept higher levels of risk. Our judgment and perception are affected, and so we do things that we wouldn't normally consider acceptable. Our ability to consider different options is also affected. So faced with a novel situation that we haven't previously encountered, when fatigued, we don't have the mental ability to devise new solutions, and so we're much more likely to resort to habit, to do what we've always done in the past. And tragically, sometimes that isn't enough. If we think about driving, how do all these changes in brain chemistry, changes to our cognitive skills, impact upon driving skill? Well, we know that the most severe consequences of fatigue, driver fatigue, are difficulty keeping our eyes open, head nodding, and other signs of microsleeps, those short, uncontrollable bouts of sleep that occur when we resist the urge to sleep. But before we get to that level of performance impairment, our driving may be affected in more subtle ways. For example, when we're fatigued, we're less likely to pay attention to safety-related tasks. Simple things like checking our mirrors, indicating, and keeping to the speed limits. Effort avoidance may also result in us driving more slowly. And this is about reducing task workload. And as a consequence, fatigued drivers may be unwilling to overtake. The impact on our visual performance may be reflected in staring vacantly at one point, or impaired visual scanning. In other words, not looking around to see what other vehicles are doing and their proximity to our vehicle. And then there may be changes to our reaction time. Our response speeds are slower. And this means that things like gear changes may become sloppy. And there may be delays in our changes to speed in response to the road or traffic conditions. In terms of those groups who are most at risk from fatigue, well, there are particular times of the day when these incidents occur, and there are also certain groups who are more prone to these kind of accidents and incidents. First of all, men, particularly those aged under 30 and those aged over 50. As with most accident statistics, young men are overrepresented, typically because they don't often take road safety seriously. However, young men are also more susceptible to the effects of fatigue than their older counterparts. As we grow older, we are also more at risk of suffering from sleep disturbance, and for older men, particularly those who are a little overweight, there is the additional risk of suffering from sleep disorders, such as obstructive sleep apnea. Shift workers, especially on their first night shift, typically because they're unlikely to have slept sufficiently during the preceding day. But then also driving home after a night shift. In this instance, drivers are fighting the natural low in alertness that occurs in the early morning, but they're also combining that with the tiredness resulting from having been awake all night. Professional drivers, truck drivers, for example, are especially prone to tiredness-related incidents because they often work long hours that leave minimal time for sleep, and they're driving during the night when ordinarily we should be asleep and our alertness is naturally low. But professional drivers tend to be regulated. Their hours of work are regulated. But company car drivers experience many of the same issues, but their hours of work are not regulated. So they may be driving for long hours without any kind of regulation to protect them. And finally, skilled manual workers, tradesmen, for example, prone to tiredness-related incidents because, like company car drivers, they may be covering long distances to get to a job, and then their work itself may be physically demanding, and then they have a long drive at the end of that work. So the combination of time of day, the workload itself, and the number of hours on the road all combine to put us at much greater risk. And for those of you who have a fleet of drivers, I'd like you to think about how many of these risk categories you and your team fit into. Now, whilst the most significant consequences of driver fatigue are collisions and crashes, fatigue results in a large number of other less significant consequences, which may go unrecognized. For example, fatigued employees are less able to deliver the high-quality customer service experience that their employer and their customers may expect. Fatigued drivers use more fuel due to the more erratic driving style associated with fatigue. And although serious collisions may be relatively rare, fatigued drivers on a daily basis may be having more minor bumps and scrapes that form the majority of a company's collision repairs, those damaged wing mirrors and dents and scratches to paintwork, often caused by clumsy driving, brought about by tiredness. This can lead to higher insurance costs, higher premiums, as well as third-party claims. It can also result in vehicles being taken out of service due to repair, leading to delays. Now, all of those are operational costs, but the human individual costs are no less significant. If fatigue is left unmanaged, there is an impact on the individual. This can result in poor morale, anxiety and stress, illness and depression, and ultimately absenteeism. And people eventually burn out and leave the company. As a consequence, there are recruitment costs and training costs. And if the problem is left unmanaged, eventually the company gets a reputation for being associated with high levels of fatigue, which means that recruitment is going to be more difficult. And all of this adds up to increased costs to the organization. And the tragedy of fatigue is that most of these costs don't get recognized. They're almost built into the bottom line, built into the company's way of working, so that the company just accepts fatigue as part and parcel of operating the way they do. So what are the main contributors to driver fatigue? Well, I distinguish between three types of contributor. First of all those operational contributors, things that are typical and part and parcel of what the company does on a day-to-day basis. Things like customer-driven key performance indicators, delivery slots at particular times of the day, delivery schedules that may be difficult to achieve, maybe even unrealistic, particularly when road conditions make it even more challenging. So a delivery schedule which is being composed based on certain traffic conditions may be very difficult to achieve on a particular day because of a change in those road traffic conditions. And then things like the pay rates, the pay structure. How are individuals rewarded? Are we inadvertently incentivizing fatigue by offering people higher pay rates to work longer hours or to work on days that would be designated as rest days? And all of this feeds into the company culture. Often the culture of the company is so significant an impact on fatigue levels, but is very unrecognized. Then we have all those features of rosters which may exacerbate fatigue. Rosters can be a very significant contributor because of the impact on the ability of individuals to obtain sufficient sleep. If an individual is working many early duties, for example, they may be having to get up very early. at a time of the day when alertness is very low. They may also have to be sleeping during the day or at an earlier time in the evening when it's difficult to achieve sleep. As a result, they may be using caffeine to stay awake. And those long hours and the overtime and working on rest days all may combine to increase an individual's fatigue levels. And then finally, we have all those lifestyle contributors, things that the organization has very little sight or control of. So does the individual have a suitable sleep environment? Or are they sharing their sleeping environment with other members of the family? What about their diet? And what about the personal stresses, the things that are impacting on their general health and well-being? Are there things that are affecting their concentration and even their ability to sleep properly? For those involved in sedentary work, such as driving, there may be work-related health issues, chronic back pain, which may exacerbate problems of sleep. Then there are the effects of being in a sedentary position for many hours and not having many opportunities for exercise. And what about all those sleep disorders we mentioned earlier, things like sleep apnea? And do individuals have access to healthcare in the same way that office-based personnel have? So all of these contributors, operational, roster-related, and lifestyle, can combine. And unless they're managed, they can increase both driver stress and driver fatigue. And when those two combine, we get problems of mental health, poor mental health. In terms of how we manage the problem, the first step, in my view, is for organizations to recognize that managing fatigue is a shared responsibility. There are clear responsibilities both for the organization and for the individual. On the organization side, the first responsibility is to provide a safe system of work, and that includes ensuring that rosters allow people adequate breaks for recovery between shifts. And we need to think about things like commute time. Do people have sufficient time off to do all the things they're going to do in their personal lives, for example, socialize with their family, eat, rest, clean themselves, dress, and then commute back into the workplace? Is there going to be sufficient time allowed for adequate sleep? And does the individual use that opportunity to obtain adequate sleep? The second responsibility for the organization is to provide individuals with the information and tools they need to enable them to manage their personal fatigue risk. And that's typically in the form of some kind of training program. The individual's responsibility then is to use that information to ensure that they manage their out-of-hours activities so that they don't adversely affect their work performance. And the final responsibility for the organization is to take seriously any reports of fatigue that are brought to their attention. And that requires that the individual feels comfortable to report operational or personal factors that could increase fatigue risk. Now, those responsibilities are a good way of asking yourself the questions. So do your rosters allow adequate breaks? Do you provide individuals with tools and the information they need to manage their fatigue risk? And do all managers treat seriously reports of fatigue brought to their attention? And on the individual side, what about those responsibilities? Do all your people use their opportunities for sleep to get adequate sleep? Do they have second jobs perhaps, or are they managing their out-of-hours activities? And how likely are people to report operational or personal factors? Do they do so willingly? Do they come forward? Or is the culture such that people may feel hindered, may feel unwilling to come forward? Now, in terms of the organizational solutions we can put in place, a few years ago, some scientists in Australia came up with this approach, and it's loosely based around Reason's hierarchy of controls approach. And it features various levels and things we can do at each of those levels to improve the management of fatigue. The first level is to ensure that we're providing people with the adequate opportunity for sleep. Secondly, we need to consider whether drivers are actually using that opportunity. Third, we need to think about whether there's evidence of fatigue-related behaviours. So when we're talking to drivers, when we're reviewing performance, is there evidence that their behaviour is affected by fatigue? And is there evidence of fatigue-related errors? And finally, when we're looking at incidents, to what extent is fatigue considered? So those 5 levels can be translated into data points, if you like, pieces of data that we can collect which will help us to understand the extent to which we're managing fatigue effectively at each level. For example, we can use a fatigue model for our scheduling. We can use experience to try and minimize the number of times that individuals are required to work at times of the day when their alertness is naturally low. We can try and find ways to minimize the amount of time that individuals will be required to sleep at a time of the day when their alertness is naturally high, because we know that sleep obtained during the day is likely to be of poorer quality and shorter, which is obviously going to have an impact on fatigue levels. In terms of trying to understand whether drivers are using their opportunity to obtain sleep, we can collect sleep information, a survey, or asking individuals to keep a diary of their sleep. Looking at fatigue-related behaviours, well, first of all, we need some kind of awareness program to raise awareness of drivers and their managers of those early warning signs of fatigue. And by educating the workforce on the warning signs to look out for, both in themselves and in their colleagues, we can improve our management of fatigue. We may also look at HR data. Is there any relationship between people's sickness rates and their shift patterns? And what about errors? What about the culture within the organisation? Is there a just culture where people feel comfortable to be open and honest about their fatigue levels? Do we have any reports of fatigue? Do we have a reporting mechanism? Is there a fatigue reporting system? Or are we simply hoping that people will come forward and be honest about fatigue? And what about the use of in-vehicle telematics? Systems designed to detect when drivers are falling asleep at the wheel or experiencing distraction. What about that data? How are we using that data? And finally, in the worst case scenario where incidents have occurred, what about our incident investigation procedures? Do they fully and effectively consider fatigue as an issue? Or perhaps, could we do more? Could we look in more detail at the timing of incidents and the pattern between incidents and shifts? So in this brief look at the issue of driver fatigue, I've tried to cover some of the key issues. I've highlighted that fatigue results from a number of key factors: not getting enough sleep, being awake for long periods of time, our time of day, that's circadian pattern influence, and workload. We know from previous research that fatigue has a significant impact on many aspects of our brains. And as a result of these changes in brain chemistry, fatigue leads to problems causing reduced alertness, increased errors, and generally poor decision making, and ultimately an increased risk of collisions. There are a variety of operational costs resulting from these problems. Apart from the tragedy of collisions, there are all those other costs which don't necessarily get counted or included in our costings. There are many contributors to fatigue, but in particular, we need to think about our roster patterns, the various work factors, the work practices that we have, which are standard within our organizations, which may inadvertently increase the likelihood of fatigue. And then those health and lifestyle factors, things that are often beyond our control within the workplace. If we are to effectively manage the risks associated with fatigue, we need to start thinking about those operational practices and getting a better understanding of which of those practices may be increasing people's fatigue risk. What can we do to minimize that risk in the first place? What I've been trying to focus on here is what we call fatigue risk management. And fatigue risk management is a data-informed process. It involves collecting data from different parts of the organization, from individuals, drivers, from human resources, from reporting, and those data sources we have within the vehicle, and combining that information to get a good understanding of who is affected by fatigue, when, and where. Ultimately, we need an effective fatigue policy as a starting point to start managing fatigue. And this should acknowledge that fatigue management is a shared responsibility. If we're to truly get a good understanding of fatigue and to make real inroads into managing the problem, we need to think about our company practices. Are the company practices that are standard and have been in place for many years giving people a realistic opportunity to meet their responsibilities, specifically their responsibility to be fit for duty and to be properly rested? Okay, thank you very much indeed for your attention. I hope that's been useful, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Thank you.
That concludes the pre-recorded section of today's webinar. A big thank you to today's speaker, Dr. Paul Jackson. I'm pleased to say that Paul is here today with us for the question and answer session. But first, we'll look at the results of today's poll. At the start of this Spotlight webinar, we asked you whether your organization has noticed an increase in fatigue-related incidents or fatigue in general related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The results of this show that 0% of you said yes, 27% said no, and 73% said you do not know. Paul, what are your thoughts on these figures? Are they roughly in line with what we might expect from Fleet at the minute?
I think it's an interesting little set of results there, really. I think the I don't know, 73% is particularly interesting, suggesting that perhaps either people haven't thought of the question in the first place or don't have the necessary systems in place to collect the kind of data that would enable them to answer that question. You might expect in the current situation that certainly fatigue levels have increased. Whether that translates into an increase in driver fatigue perhaps is another question. So I think there's a lot of variation in individuals in terms of how they've coped with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on their fatigue levels. Some people say they've been sleeping better. Others, through causes such as problems of stress and worry about their livelihood, for example, or their jobs, have had impaired sleep. So there's likely to be quite a variety of situations that people are encountering.
Moving on to some of today's questions then. For organizations who may be just starting out on their journey looking at fatigue as something they feel they need to care for as fleets, what would you recommend as a good place for them to start?
Good place to start. I think there's a couple of things they could do. One thing would be a hazard identification workshop. In other words, getting a group of people key stakeholders within the business sitting down and trying to understand what are the main contributors to fatigue associated with your standard operational practices. You know, what is it that we do that may have an impact on people's fatigue levels? Obviously, it would be useful to have some understanding of accident data if you have that available. But of course, accidents only highlight the worst case scenario when all the controls you have in place have failed. Another thing you might want to do is to run a survey of your workforce, getting an understanding of how fatigue is impacting on both their operational and work performance and on their home lives. Those two things together, I think, would provide you with a useful starting point in terms of data.
Excellent, thank you very much. Another question here. Do you have any examples of things that may have worked in fleet organizations you've seen, of ways they can raise awareness with drivers around their own health and well-being and how that links into fatigue?
Well, I've put together a lot of training programs over the years, and I think one of the things that's always been better received by drivers is where that training doesn't just trot out the standard generic information on fatigue or driver fatigue, where training is tailored to their specific situation. So, you know, the shift patterns that they're operating, providing guidance on how to sleep when you're working, for example, a very early shift or a night shift, when to structure your sleep, when to nap. That kind of tailored guidance is much better received by drivers because they can see that it's of relevance to their situation. I think the kind of training that always struggles to gain traction within an organization is training which is simply generic, you know, off the shelf, and doesn't speak the language of the workforce.
Great, well, thank you very much. We have run over time today for the spotlight session, so I'm afraid that'll be the last question we take. A big thank you again to Paul for today's presentation. I hope you all found it interesting, and there's information in there you can use to work towards our shared goal of safe and healthy mobility in fleets. If you'd like to continue any of the conversations we've started at today's webinar, you can do so on our Global Fleet Champions Twitter or LinkedIn page. And just wanted to remind everyone, we do have an upcoming webinar on December the 8th about essential checks for managing work-related road risks. If that sounds like something of interest, you can register that now on our website.